The Mystery of Hitler's Inner Circle. April 1945. Berlin is burning. Allied bombings have turned the German capital into a landscape of rubble and fire. Entire districts lie in ruins. Buildings collapse into dust. The sound of artillery echoes through the streets as the Soviet army closes in from every direction. The Third Reich is collapsing. But deep beneath the destroyed Reich Chancellery, hidden under layers of concrete and steel, a small underground bunker still functions as the center of the dying regime. Inside that bunker sit some of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany. Just a few years earlier, these men had controlled an empire that stretched across most of Europe. They commanded armies. They controlled vast industries. They shaped the fate of millions of people. But now, everything is different. The empire they helped build is falling apart before their eyes, and with it, their own futures. Some of them remain loyal to the very end. Some begin to quietly think about escape. Others are already wondering how history will judge them. But there is something strange about the fate of Hitler's inner circle, something that historians still find difficult to explain. Almost every man who stood closest to Hitler ended in disaster. Not in peaceful retirement, not in quiet obscurity. Instead, their stories ended in suicide, execution, prison, or mysterious disappearance. Heinrich Himmler, one of the most powerful men in the entire Nazi regime, killed himself shortly after being captured. Joseph Goebbels, the regime's propaganda mastermind, poisoned his own 6 children in the bunker before taking his own life. Hermann Göring, once considered Hitler's successor, swallowed cyanide only hours before he was scheduled to be executed. Martin Bormann, the man who controlled access to Hitler himself, vanished during the chaotic fall of Berlin. Rudolf Hess spent the rest of his life in prison, cut off from the world he once helped shape. And even Albert Speer, one of the few who survived the war, spent the rest of his life trying to explain his role in the regime. It almost looks like a pattern, as if the system they helped create eventually turned against them. But why? Why did so many powerful figures end their lives in such dramatic and tragic ways? Why did none of them truly escape the collapse of the regime they built? To understand this mystery, we have to go back. Not to the final days of the war, but to the beginning, to 1933. The year Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. At that moment, the Nazi movement had seized political power, but the future of Germany was still uncertain. Around Hitler stood a group of men who would become the architects of the Third Reich. They were very different from each other. Some were ideological fanatics. Others were skilled bureaucrats and administrators. Some were ambitious politicians who saw an opportunity to rise to power. But they all shared one belief. They thought they were building something that would last for 1,000 years. The empire, they imagined, would dominate Europe and reshape history itself. However, hidden beneath the surface of this new regime was a dangerous flaw. From the outside, the Nazi government appeared to be a strict hierarchy of authority. But in reality, the system was far more chaotic. Power was never clearly defined. Different institutions overlapped, rival organizations competed for influence, and the men closest to Hitler were constantly fighting for his attention and approval. Sometimes quietly, sometimes openly, and sometimes in ways that became deadly. Hitler rarely gave clear instructions about who was truly in charge. Instead, he allowed his subordinates to compete with one another. Each man tried to prove that he was the most loyal, the most useful, the most valuable to the regime. Over time, this competition created a system driven by rivalry and suspicion. Trust became rare. Alliances shifted constantly, and everyone understood one terrifying reality. In this system, losing influence could mean losing everything. Careers could disappear overnight. Power could vanish in an instant. And sometimes the price of failure was not just political defeat, but death. This is why the story of Hitler's inner circle is not just a story about politics or war. It is a story about power, ambition, fear, and betrayal. It is the story of a system that slowly consumed the very men who helped create it. And to understand how this system worked, we need to take a closer look at the men who stood beside Hitler in the early years of his rise to power. Because it was during those first years that the hidden rules of the Third Reich were written. Rules that 12 years later would lead almost all of them to the same inevitable end. The men behind Hitler's power. To understand why the men around Hitler eventually met such tragic ends, we must first understand who they were. These were not ordinary politicians. They were the architects of one of the most powerful and terrifying regimes in modern history. Each of them held enormous power. Each controlled a different part of the system that kept the Third Reich functioning. And each believed that his position in Hitler's circle was secure. But in reality, the world around Hitler was anything but stable. It was a court of ambition, rivalry, and constant competition. And the men who stood closest to him were not allies in the traditional sense. They were competitors. The first of these men was Heinrich Himmler. At first glance, Himmler did not look like a powerful leader. He was quiet, pale, and often described as awkward. But behind that appearance was a man who was building one of the most powerful organizations in Nazi Germany. As the head of the SS, Himmler created a vast security empire. What began as a small personal guard unit eventually grew into a massive structure that controlled intelligence, internal security, and the system of concentration camps. Himmler believed he was shaping the ideological future of the regime, and for many years his power continued to expand. Then there was Joseph Goebbels. Unlike Himmler, Goebbels was a master of words and emotion. As the regime's propaganda minister, he understood something many politicians did not. Control the story, and you can influence how people see reality. Through newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, and massive rallies, Goebbels helped create the public image of the Nazi state. He presented the regime as strong, unstoppable, and united. But behind the carefully constructed image, the leadership was anything but united. Another powerful figure was Hermann Göring. A decorated fighter pilot from the First World War, Göring was one of the earliest supporters of Hitler. He quickly rose through the ranks and became one of the most visible leaders of the regime. For a time, Göring appeared to be the second most powerful man in Germany. He controlled the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, and oversaw large parts of the country's economic and military expansion. He lived in luxury, surrounded by art, wealth, and influence. But power in Hitler's world was never permanent. Another man quietly rising within the regime was Martin Bormann. Unlike Göring, Bormann did not seek attention. He rarely appeared in public. But he understood something crucial about power inside Hitler's circle. Access was everything. Bormann gradually became the man who controlled the flow of information to Hitler. He organized meetings, handled documents, and decided which requests reached the leader's desk. In doing so, he gained enormous hidden influence. Many officials realized that if they wanted something from Hitler, they first had to go through Bormann. Then there was Rudolf Hess. For years, Hess had been one of Hitler's most loyal followers. As deputy Führer, he helped manage the Nazi Party and oversaw many of its internal affairs. His influence came not from dramatic speeches or military authority, but from his personal loyalty to Hitler. For a long time, that loyalty seemed to guarantee his position. Finally, there was Albert Speer. Speer was different from the others. He was not known for fiery speeches or political maneuvering. Instead, he was an architect. He designed the massive structures and grand rally grounds that helped create the visual image of the regime. Over time, his technical skills and efficiency made him one of the most important administrators within the Nazi system. Each of these men held tremendous authority. Each believed he understood how the regime worked. But what many of them failed to realize was that the system they served was not built on stability. It was built on competition. Power was never clearly defined. Responsibilities overlapped. Different organizations competed for control of the same resources, and the men closest to Hitler were constantly trying to prove their value. Some did it through loyalty, others through ambition, others through ruthless efficiency. But in this environment, trust became rare. Alliances shifted constantly, and every man knew that influence could disappear overnight. In Hitler's world, being powerful today did not guarantee safety tomorrow. The system rewarded success. But it also punished weakness, and the closer someone stood to the center of power, the more dangerous that position became. Because inside this circle of influence, ambition and fear were always growing. And eventually, that competition would begin to tear the entire leadership apart. The hidden struggle for power. By 1945, the collapse of the regime was visible everywhere. Cities were burning, armies were retreating, and the leadership that once appeared powerful and united was slowly falling apart. But the truth is, the struggle inside the leadership had begun long before the final days of the war. In fact, rivalry had been built into the system from the very beginning. At first glance, the government of Nazi Germany appeared highly organized. There were ministries, military commands, political offices, and powerful security organizations. But behind this structure, something very unusual was happening. Power inside the regime was deliberately unclear. Responsibilities often overlapped. Different institutions were given similar tasks, and multiple leaders were placed in positions where their authority competed with each other. Instead of one clear chain of command, there were several parallel systems. This created confusion. But it also created competition. The men closest to Hitler constantly tried to prove that they were more useful than their rivals. Every decision became a way to gain influence. Every success increased someone's standing, and every failure could destroy a career overnight. This competition shaped the behavior of the entire leadership. Himmler expanded the reach of the security apparatus. Göring tried to strengthen his position through military power and economic influence. Goebbels focused on controlling the narrative of the war through propaganda. Bormann quietly increased his control over access to Hitler himself. Each of them believed that the best way to secure their future was to become indispensable. But that also meant pushing their rivals aside. Sometimes this rivalry was subtle. Officials competed for resources, authority, and influence behind closed doors. But other times, the conflicts became much more open. Leaders criticized each other's decisions. They blamed each other for failures. They fought for control over the same institutions and responsibilities. As long as the regime appeared strong, this system of competition seemed to work. Early military victories and rapid expansion masked the tensions inside the leadership. But war has a way of exposing weaknesses. And once Germany's situation began to deteriorate, the rivalry inside the regime intensified. Military defeats created panic. Resources became scarce. And the pressure to prove loyalty and usefulness increased dramatically. Some leaders tried to shift blame for failures onto others. Others attempted to present themselves as the only ones capable of solving the crisis. The struggle for influence became more desperate. And the closer the war came to its end, the more fragile the leadership became. Inside the bunker and across the remaining government offices, fear began to replace confidence. Men who once believed they were shaping history were now trying to protect their own positions. Some began to think about survival after the war. Others tried to maintain their loyalty to the very end. But beneath the surface, the system itself was starting to turn inward. Because a structure built on rivalry cannot remain stable forever. Eventually, the competition becomes destructive. Alliances collapse, trust disappears, and the system begins to consume its own leaders. By the final months of the war, the inner circle that had once helped build the Third Reich was no longer united. It was divided by suspicion, ambition, and fear. And this internal struggle would soon play a major role in how the final days of the regime unfolded. The men who once fought together to gain power were now competing for something very different. Not influence, not prestige, but survival. By the final months of World War II, the leadership of the Third Reich no longer looked like a confident government. Instead, it resembled a group of powerful men trapped inside a system that was falling apart. Cities were burning, armies were collapsing on multiple fronts, and inside the underground headquarters of the regime, tension and uncertainty had replaced the confidence that once defined Nazi leadership. But to understand why the collapse of the regime was so chaotic, historians often point to a deeper explanation. They argue that the system of power inside Nazi Germany was never designed to be stable. In fact, many believe it was intentionally built to create competition. Adolf Hitler rarely created clear structures of authority. In most governments, power flows through a defined chain of command. Responsibilities are organized. Leaders know exactly where their authority begins and ends. But the system surrounding Hitler functioned very differently. Instead of assigning one clear authority to each task, Hitler often allowed multiple organizations to operate in the same area. Government ministries competed with party institutions. Security organizations overlapped with political offices. Military leaders often found themselves in conflict with political administrators. This created a confusing web of authority where no single figure held complete control over a specific area. At first glance, this system appeared inefficient and disorganized, but it served a very important purpose. It ensured that no one around Hitler could ever become powerful enough to challenge him. Because if several leaders were responsible for the same task, they would inevitably compete with one another. And in that competition, each of them needed something only one person could provide: Hitler's approval. Every decision became a way to gain favor. Every success increased someone's influence. And every failure created an opportunity for a rival to move forward. This structure turned the leadership into a constant competition for power and recognition. Officials tried to prove their loyalty not only through obedience, but through initiative. Instead of waiting for clear instructions, many attempted to anticipate what Hitler wanted. Historians sometimes describe this behavior as working toward the leader. In other words, officials acted according to what they believed Hitler would approve of, even when he had not given direct orders. This encouraged extreme actions. Ambitious leaders believed that bold decisions would demonstrate loyalty and commitment. Over time, the system rewarded those who acted aggressively and punished those who hesitated. At the same time, this environment created deep mistrust inside the leadership, because power was never guaranteed. Even the most influential figures understood that their position depended entirely on remaining useful. A leader who failed to deliver results could quickly lose influence. A rival could take advantage of that weakness. And once someone began to fall out of favor, the system moved rapidly to replace them. For many years, this structure appeared to work. Germany expanded rapidly. Military victories created the illusion of strength and stability. The leadership seemed powerful and unstoppable. But victory often hides the weaknesses of a system. And when the tide of war began to turn, those weaknesses became impossible to ignore. Military defeats increased pressure inside the leadership. Resources became scarce, and officials began to search for someone to blame. The same rivalry that once helped the regime grow now began to tear it apart. Alliances collapsed. Accusations spread, and fear slowly replaced ambition. By 1945, the men who once competed for influence inside Hitler's circle were facing a very different reality. The system they had relied on for power was collapsing, and the competition that once drove them forward now offered no protection. Because when a system built on rivalry begins to fail, it does not collapse outward. It collapses inward, turning against the very people who once believed they controlled it. By April 1945, the world that Hitler's inner circle had spent more than a decade building was collapsing around them. Berlin was surrounded. The Red Army was pushing deeper into the city with every passing day. Explosions echoed through the streets above the bunker. Inside the underground headquarters beneath the Reich Chancellery, the final chapter of the regime was unfolding. For years, the men closest to Hitler had competed for power, influence, and authority. Now they were facing something very different. The question was no longer who would gain power. The question was who would survive. As the situation grew more desperate, the leadership began to fracture. Some remained loyal to the very end. Others quietly searched for ways to escape the consequences of defeat. The system that had once rewarded loyalty and ambition was now offering no protection at all. One of the most powerful figures in the regime, Heinrich Himmler, began to realize that the war could not be won. For years, he had built an enormous security empire, but in the final months of the conflict, even he began to search for a way out. Behind the scenes, Himmler attempted to make contact with Western leaders, hoping to negotiate a separate surrender. He believed that by presenting himself as a useful negotiator, he might secure his own survival. But when Hitler learned about these secret negotiations, the reaction was immediate. Himmler was declared a traitor. The man who had once been one of the most powerful figures in the entire regime suddenly found himself abandoned and hunted. Shortly after being captured by Allied forces, Himmler took his own life. Joseph Goebbels made a very different choice. For years, he had been the voice of the regime, shaping its propaganda and defending its image. Even as defeat became inevitable, Goebbels refused to abandon the system he had helped create. He remained in the bunker with Hitler during the final days of the war. After Hitler's death, Goebbels briefly became the leader of what remained of the government. But he knew that the regime could not survive. In a final, tragic act, Goebbels and his wife chose to poison their 6 children before taking their own lives. Hermann Göring, once considered Hitler's successor, attempted another path. As the war collapsed, Göring sent a message suggesting that he should assume leadership of Germany if Hitler was unable to govern. But inside the bunker, Martin Bormann presented this message as an act of betrayal. Hitler reacted with anger. Göring was stripped of his titles and placed under arrest. After the war, he was captured by Allied forces and brought to trial. Facing execution, Göring ended his life with poison only hours before the sentence could be carried out. Martin Bormann himself attempted to escape Berlin as the city fell. For years, he had controlled access to Hitler, quietly shaping decisions from behind the scenes. But when the regime finally collapsed, his influence could not save him. In the chaos of Berlin's final battle, Bormann disappeared. For decades, his fate remained uncertain, surrounded by rumors and speculation. Eventually, evidence confirmed that he had died while attempting to flee the city. Rudolf Hess, who had once been one of Hitler's closest loyalists, had already spent the final years of the war in captivity after his strange flight to Britain in 1941. After the war, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. He would spend decades in prison, becoming the last surviving member of the inner circle. Albert Speer was one of the few who managed to survive the collapse of the regime. At the Nuremberg trials, Speer admitted a degree of responsibility for the actions of the government. This admission helped him avoid execution. Instead, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Yet even after his release, questions about his true role in the regime would follow him for the rest of his life. Looking back at the fate of Hitler's inner circle, a clear pattern begins to emerge. These were men who believed they were building an empire that would last 1,000 years. But the system they helped create was built on rivalry, fear, and constant competition. For years, that system rewarded ambition and loyalty. But once defeat arrived, it offered no protection. Instead, it turned inward, consuming the very people who had once stood at the center of its power. In the end, the story of Hitler's inner circle is not only a story about the collapse of a regime. It is a reminder of what happens when a system built on fear and rivalry finally reaches its breaking point. Because when such a system falls, it rarely leaves its creators untouched.